Story number 1.
When I moved into my new apartment, I was excited to finally have a place of my own. It was a small one-bedroom unit in an older building downtown, but it had charm. Wooden floors, big windows that let in plenty of light, and a quirky little balcony overlooking a quiet street. The rent was surprisingly affordable, and I didn't think twice about signing the lease. The first week was uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking and arranging furniture, getting used to the creaks and groans of the old building. My neighbors seemed friendly enough, though I rarely saw them. The elderly woman across the hall smiled at me once, but didn't say much, and a man on the floor above me nodded in passing, but kept to himself. It was quiet, and I liked that. But by the second week, things started to feel off. It began with the noises. At first, I chalked it up to the usual sounds of an old building. Pipes rattling, floorboards creaking, maybe even the wind slipping through the cracks in the windows. But these noises were different. Late at night, I would hear faint footsteps above me, but when I asked the man upstairs about it, he said he worked the night shift and wasn't home during those hours. Then, I noticed the shadows. In the corner of my living room, just past the edge of my vision, I would catch glimpses of movement. It wasn't dramatic, just a flicker, like someone shifting in the shadows. Each time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was still adjusting to the new space, after all. One night, I stayed up late reading in bed. The apartment was silent except for the occasional hum of the fridge. I was just about to turn off the light when I heard it. A faint knock, almost imperceptible, coming from my bedroom wall. I froze, my heart pounding. The wall in question was shared with the unit next door, but I hadn't seen anyone moving in or out of that apartment since I'd arrived. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself. The knocking stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a neighbor or even the pipes settling. I turned off the light and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone or something was on the other side of that wall. Over the next few days, the knocking became more frequent. It would happen at random times, early in the morning, late at night, even in the middle of the day. I tried asking the building manager about the unit next door, but he just shrugged. "No one's rented that apartment in years," he said. "It's empty." That made no sense. If it was empty, who or what was knocking? One evening, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I went out into the hallway and stood in front of the door to the apartment next to mine. It looked just like all the other doors, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. The air felt heavier here, colder. I knocked once, hesitating before I did so. The sound echoed down the empty hallway. No one answered. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. I turned to leave, but just as I was stepping away, I heard it. A faint, shuffling sound coming from inside the apartment. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. It sounded like someone moving around, dragging their feet across the floor. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the door. The sound stopped. I hurried back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. That night, the knocking on the wall was louder, more insistent. It didn't stop for hours, and when it finally did, I was too shaken to sleep. The following morning, I noticed something strange. On the floor near the wall where the knocking always happened, there was a small pile of dust. At first, I thought it was just from the old plaster, but when I bent down to clean it up, I saw something else. Tiny scratches like claw marks etched into the wooden floorboards. They formed no discernible pattern, just random, frantic lines. I stared at them, feeling a chill run down my spine. That night, I decided to stay up and record the noises. I set my phone on the nightstand, hit record, and waited. The knocking started again, just after midnight. It was louder this time, more deliberate. I lay there, heart racing, listening to the rhythmic thudding. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. There was silence for a moment, and then I heard something else. A low, guttural whisper. It was faint, almost impossible to make out, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was angry. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and then it stopped abruptly. My bedroom door slammed shut on its own. I screamed, fumbling for the light switch. When the room was flooded with light, everything was still. My door was closed, but nothing else seemed out of place. My phone was still recording, and when I played it back, the knocking and the whispering were clear as day. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I packed a bag and planned to crash at a friend's place for a few days while I figured out what to do. As I was leaving, I saw the elderly woman from across the hall. She was standing in her doorway, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just for a little while." She nodded, her eyes sad. "It's for the best. That apartment, it's not a good place." I stopped, staring at her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "There was a man who lived there before you. Years ago. He was troubled. No one knew much about him, but he kept to himself. One day, he just disappeared. No one ever found him. Some people say he never left." My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and left. I never went back to that apartment. I broke my lease, losing my deposit in the process, but I didn't care. Whatever was in that place, it wasn't something I could live with. Even now, I can't explain what happened, but sometimes, late at night, I'll hear faint knocking, just for a moment before it fades away.
Story number 2.
When I signed the lease for my new apartment, I couldn't believe my luck. It was a spacious one-bedroom on the top floor of a historic building, with tall windows and a view of the city skyline. The price was well below what I had expected for the area, but the landlord assured me there was no catch. It was everything I wanted, and I moved in within the week. The first few nights were blissfully quiet. The walls were thick, and I couldn't hear a sound from my neighbors. I had just finished unpacking when I first noticed something strange. It wasn't anything dramatic, just small, odd details that didn't make sense. The first thing was the light in the hallway. Every time I came home after dark, the light outside my door would be flickering. It wasn't the building's usual fluorescent bulb flicker. It was rhythmic, like someone was flipping the switch off and on deliberately. I mentioned it to the landlord, and he said he'd have maintenance look at it, but nothing changed. Then came the sounds. At night, as I lay in bed, I started hearing faint creaks and groans coming from the apartment above me. It sounded like someone pacing, their steps slow and deliberate. I didn't think much of it at first, just a neighbor who couldn't sleep. But when I mentioned it to another tenant in the laundry room, they gave me a strange look. "There's no one above you," they said. "The top floor is empty. It's been empty for months." I laughed it off, telling myself they were mistaken. Maybe someone had moved in recently and they just didn't know. But that night, the noises grew louder. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. I could hear faint whispers, so quiet I couldn't make out the words, but persistent enough to keep me awake. The following day, I decided to check it out. I climbed the narrow staircase to the top floor, half expecting to find someone unpacking boxes. But the hall was dark and silent. All the doors were shut, and the air felt unnaturally still. I walked down the hall, peering at the names on the mail slots. They were all blank. When I got to the door directly above my unit, I froze. The doorknob was scratched, as if someone had been clawing at it. My skin prickled, but I told myself it was probably from old tenants, maybe someone who had lost their keys. Still, the air felt heavier up there, like I was being watched. I hurried back downstairs and tried to push it from my mind. But things got worse. A week later, I woke up to the sound of banging. It was coming from the ceiling, so loud it shook the light fixture in my bedroom. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, like someone was pounding on the floor above me. I checked the time, 3:12 a.m. Furious, I threw on a sweatshirt and stormed upstairs, ready to confront whoever was making the racket. When I got to the top floor, the hallway was pitch black. I could barely see in front of me, but I followed the sound of the banging to the door I'd seen before. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound assertive. The banging stopped. I waited, my hand hovering near the door, but there was no response. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the door, and that's when I heard it. The whispering again. It was faint, almost like a hiss, but this time I could make out words. "Leave. Now." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and fled down the stairs. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and in the morning I called the landlord. "There's someone in the apartment above me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They've been making noise all night." He sighed on the other end of the line. "I told you, there's no one up there. The top floor has been vacant for months." I demanded he check it out, and reluctantly, he agreed to meet me that afternoon. When we went upstairs together, he unlocked the door to the apartment, and I braced myself for what I might see. The unit was empty. There was no furniture, no boxes, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. The air was stale and cold, and the windows were covered in a thick layer of dust. I pointed out the scratched doorknob, but the landlord just shrugged. "It's an old building," he said. "Stuff like this happens." I didn't believe him, but what could I say? I knew what I'd heard, but there was no proof. That night, the banging didn't return. But the next morning, I woke up to something even worse. On the floor of my bedroom, right beneath where the banging had come from, was a single blackened handprint. It was too large to be mine and smeared as if whoever had left it had pressed down with force. My stomach churned, and I scrubbed at it with a sponge until it faded, but the feeling of unease lingered. The next few days were quiet, almost too quiet. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every small sound. Then, one evening, as I was sitting in the living room, the light in my apartment flickered. I looked up, annoyed, but before I could get up to check, I saw it. A figure, standing in the corner of the room. It was shadowy, barely more than an outline, but it was there. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't sleep that night, and the next morning, I packed a bag and left. I stayed with a friend for a few days, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But when I finally worked up the courage to go back, I found my apartment in disarray. Cabinets were open, furniture had been moved, and on the wall of my bedroom, scratched into the plaster, were the words, "You were warned." I moved out the next day, breaking my lease and leaving half my belongings behind. I don't know who or what was in that apartment, but I know one thing for certain: I wasn't alone. Story the end.
Story number 3.
When I moved into my new apartment, I wasn't expecting much. It was just a temporary place while I figured out my next steps after a breakup. The building was older but well-maintained, and the price was right. The landlord, a cheerful man in his 60s named Mr. Dempsey, handed me the keys with a smile and said, "This place has some history, but it's solid. You'll like it here." The apartment itself was modest. One bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room with a large bay window that overlooked the quiet street below. It had a strange charm, with creaky wooden floors and a faint scent of lavender that seemed to linger in the air. At first, everything seemed normal. I spent the first week unpacking, settling into a routine and getting used to the peculiarities of the building. The elevator was ancient, groaning loudly as it moved, and the pipes in the bathroom rattled whenever I turned on the hot water. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't mind. Then things started to happen. It began with small noises at night. I'd hear faint creaking, as though someone were walking in the hallway outside my door. At first, I thought it was one of my neighbors, but when I peeked through the peephole, the hallway was always empty. The noises continued for several nights, and I convinced myself it was just the building settling. One evening, as I was watching TV, I heard a soft thud coming from the bedroom. It was subtle, but enough to make me pause. I muted the TV and listened, straining to hear. Another thud, followed by a faint scratching sound. My heart began to race. Grabbing my phone, I walked cautiously to the bedroom, flipping on the light. The room was empty. I checked the closet, under the bed, and even the window, but everything was secure. Shaking my head, I told myself it was probably nothing. A branch hitting the window or a draft causing something to shift. But as I walked back to the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I mentioned the noises to Mr. Dempsey when I ran into him in the lobby. He laughed it off, saying, "Old buildings have their quirks. You'll get used to it." His response didn't exactly reassure me, but I decided to let it go. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was definitely coming from inside the apartment. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound seemed to be coming from the living room. Gripping my phone tightly, I turned on the flashlight and crept out of the bedroom. The living room was empty, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I stood there for a moment, scanning the room, when the whispering suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Things escalated quickly after that. One morning, I found all the kitchen cabinets open, even though I was certain I had closed them the night before. Another time, I came home from work to find a picture frame that had been on the bookshelf lying shattered on the floor. I started to feel uneasy in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every little sound. The breaking point came late one night when I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. I heard the whispering again, but this time it was louder and more distinct. It sounded like multiple voices speaking in hushed tones. My body froze as I realized the sound was coming from right outside my bedroom door. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed a heavy flashlight from my nightstand and approached the door. I flung it open, expecting to find, I didn't know what, but the hallway was empty. Just as I was about to step back into my room, I felt a sudden, intense, cold rush past me, making my breath fog in the air. My instincts screamed at me to get out. The next morning, I called Mr. Dempsey and told him I needed to break my lease. He seemed understanding but didn't ask any questions. As I packed up my things, I found something I hadn't noticed before, a small, hidden compartment in the floor of the bedroom closet. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open. Inside was an old, dusty notebook. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, but the ink had faded so much that most of the words were illegible. One entry, however, stood out. "It won't let me sleep. It whispers all night. I thought I was alone, but I was wrong. I can't stay here any longer." I slammed the notebook shut and shoved it back into the compartment. I didn't want to know anything more. I left the apartment that same day and never looked back. A few weeks later, I saw a listing for the unit online, advertised as a charming vintage apartment with lots of character. I wondered who would move in next and if they'd hear the whispers too.
Story number 4.
I had been searching for months, desperately trying to find a new apartment. After my breakup, I needed a fresh start, something to help me leave the past behind. The apartment I found was perfect. It was a small one-bedroom in a historic building near downtown. The rent was within my budget, and the building had an old charm that drew me in. The exposed brick walls, tall windows, and high ceilings made it feel cozy and unique. I immediately knew it was where I wanted to live. The landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Monroe, showed me around the apartment. She was sweet, but seemed a little odd, almost too eager to get me to sign the lease. "You'll be very happy here," she said. "This building has so much history, you won't find anything like it." I didn't think much of her comments at the time. I just wanted a place to call my own. The first few days in the apartment were perfect. The neighborhood was quiet, and the apartment itself was just as charming as I had remembered. I spent my days unpacking, organizing, and enjoying my solitude. But after a week, I started to notice something strange. At night, the apartment seemed to creak and groan in ways that felt unnatural. I'd hear soft footsteps, like someone was walking around in the hall outside my door. It wasn't the building settling. It was rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone was pacing. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it was just the old building. The neighbors were probably moving around, and the walls were thin. But then, things started to get worse. One night, I was in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard a loud bang, followed by the sound of something heavy scraping across the floor. My heart raced. I sat up, trying to make sense of the noise. It was coming from the living room. Hesitant, I grabbed my phone and crept into the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. When I reached the living room, the source of the noise was clear. The heavy bookshelf that I had carefully arranged earlier was overturned, its contents scattered across the floor. I froze, my blood running cold. There was no way this could have happened on its own. I checked the windows, the door, and even the balcony. Everything was locked. My mind raced, but I couldn't explain how the bookshelf had tipped over. Maybe I hadn't placed it properly, or perhaps a draft had caused it to fall, but it didn't feel right. The air in the apartment seemed thick with tension, like something was watching me. The next day, I called Mrs. Monroe to ask if there had been any reports of strange occurrences in the building. She didn't answer my question directly, but instead said, "It's an old building, my dear. Sometimes the past likes to remind us it's still here." I didn't know what to make of her cryptic response, but I pushed it aside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off in the apartment. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the soft whispering. It was so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it. But then it grew louder, like someone was standing just outside my door, murmuring unintelligible words. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering stopped suddenly, and I heard footsteps moving away from my door, retreating down the hallway. I didn't know what to do. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me, or was there someone inside my apartment? I couldn't bring myself to check. I pulled the blankets tightly around me, trying to ignore the fear creeping up my spine. The next morning, I found something odd. On the floor in front of the door, there was a small black feather. It looked out of place, like it had been carefully placed there. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach churning. I didn't own any birds, and I hadn't seen any in the building. I couldn't explain how it had gotten there, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. That evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I searched the apartment, looking for anything that could explain the strange happenings. As I checked the closet in the bedroom, I noticed something strange. A small, hidden compartment in the floor. I had never seen it before. My curiosity got the best of me, and I pried it open. Inside was an old leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was faint but legible. I began to read, my heart racing as I took in the words. I hear them at night, the footsteps, the whispers. They tell me to leave, but I can't. It's like the building is alive and it wants me to stay. I can't escape. The journal was filled with similar entries, each one more desperate than the last. Whoever had lived here before me had clearly been frightened, driven to the edge by whatever haunted the apartment. I shuddered as I closed the journal and shoved it back into the compartment. That night, the whispering returned, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I could hear the voice clearly now, soft, feminine, and pleading. Leave, please, leave before it's too late. I felt the cold fingers of fear crawl up my spine as I lay in bed, paralyzed by the sound. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I had only been in the apartment for a few weeks, and I didn't want to admit that I was scared. But every night, the whispers grew louder, the footsteps more distinct, and the feeling of being watched more overwhelming. The next day, I went to the building's management office to speak with Mrs. Monroe. When I asked her about the previous tenant, she became visibly uncomfortable. "Why are you asking about her?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "There's nothing to be concerned about. She was just a tenant who didn't stay long. Sometimes people move on. It's nothing unusual." But the look in her eyes told me there was more to the story. I pressed her further, but she shut down, insisting that I was imagining things and that old buildings often had quirks. That night, I decided I had had enough. I packed a bag and left the apartment. I couldn't stay there any longer, not with the whispers and the strange occurrences. As I walked down the hallway to the exit, I passed by the apartment's door one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw something move behind the frosted glass. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I never went back to that apartment. A few weeks later, I saw a listing for it online, freshly renovated, ready for new tenants. I wondered who would be brave enough to move in and whether they would hear the whispers too.
Story number 5.
I had just moved into my new apartment in the heart of the city. The place was perfect for me. A small one-bedroom unit on the 4th floor of an old building. The rent was affordable, the location was prime, and the building had a certain charm to it. The landlord, a middle-aged man named Mr. Smith, was friendly enough. He gave me the keys, showed me the place, and assured me that everything was in working order. The building was older but well-maintained, with hardwood floors, high ceilings, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. It was the kind of place that had character, the kind of place I thought I could settle into after moving away from my old life. The first few days were fine. I spent my time unpacking, setting up my furniture, and getting used to the creaks and groans of the building. The neighbors seemed quiet, and the streets outside were always bustling with activity. I didn't think much of it when I noticed a few things in the apartment seemed slightly off, like the door to the bathroom that never quite closed all the way, or the light in the hallway that flickered occasionally. It was an old building, after all. On the fifth night, things took a turn. I had just finished dinner and was watching TV when I heard a soft knock on the door. It was strange. No one had visited me since I'd moved in. I hesitated before walking over and peering through the peephole. There was no one there. I shrugged it off as a neighbor or someone just passing by. Maybe it was the wind. But the knocking continued for the next several nights, always at the same time, around 10 p.m. It wasn't a loud knock, more like a soft tap, almost like someone was trying to get my attention. The thing was, when I opened the door, no one was there. I didn't know what to make of it. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was hearing things, or maybe it was a neighbor playing a prank. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. A few days later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound coming from the kitchen. It was faint at first, like something tapping against the floor. I lay in bed, holding my breath, trying to make sense of it. The sound continued, growing louder and more persistent. Slowly, I got out of bed, grabbed my phone for light, and crept into the kitchen. Everything was as it should be, the dishes in the sink, the refrigerator humming softly. But when I looked down at the floor, I saw it. A single small object, lying near the doorway. It was a button, a plain old button. I bent down to pick it up, wondering how it had gotten there. The apartment had been empty when I moved in. No clothes, no loose items. It wasn't mine. I didn't have any buttons like that. I stood there for a moment, holding the button in my hand, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. It felt like something was watching me. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment wasn't as empty as it seemed. That night, I decided to try something. I left my phone on the kitchen counter, set to record sound, and went to bed. I told myself that I was being paranoid, that there was nothing to worry about. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Around midnight, the recording on my phone picked up strange noises. The soft tapping again, followed by a rustling sound as if someone was moving around in the kitchen. I didn't know what to think. The phone had been left on the counter, but no one had been in the apartment with me. The next day, I played the recording for myself, my heart racing as I listened to the sounds. The tapping, the rustling, and then something I couldn't quite make out. A low, guttural sound, like a sigh or a whisper. I was terrified. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Could it have been the pipes? Was it just the building settling? But the sound felt too real, too deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with me. I called Mr. Smith the following day, trying to sound calm. I asked him if anything strange had ever happened in the building. He seemed hesitant, almost uncomfortable, but he assured me that everything was fine. It's an old building, he said. Nothing to worry about. Just ignore any odd noises. It's probably just the walls creaking. I wasn't convinced, but I let it go, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. The knocking continued, night after night. I started locking the door before bed, even though I knew no one could get in without a key. It was a comforting ritual, something to ease my growing anxiety. But then, one evening, as I was sitting in the living room, I heard something different. It wasn't a knock. It was a voice. It was faint at first, a whisper just on the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was the wind outside, but then it came again, closer this time, almost as if someone was standing just behind me. Leave. It was a woman's voice, breathy and urgent. My blood ran cold. I jumped up, heart pounding in my chest. I turned around, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but no one was there. I ran to the door, opened it, and stepped into the hallway. It was empty. The air was still, and the only sound was the hum of the old elevator at the end of the hall. I looked both ways, half expecting to see someone watching me, but there was nothing. The whispering stopped, but I could still feel it, like a presence lingering just out of sight, pressing in on me. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, too afraid to sleep. The silence was unbearable. I kept glancing toward the hallway, waiting for the voice to return. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and called a moving company. I didn't care if it was irrational. I didn't want to stay there any longer. As I was leaving, I ran into Mr. Smith in the lobby. I was almost too afraid to look at him, but I managed to ask, "Has anyone else complained about strange things happening in the building?" He looked at me, his face a mask of neutrality. "No, of course not. It's just an old building with old quirks. Don't worry about it." But as I walked out the door, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move across the top floor window, even though no one was supposed to be there. I never returned to that apartment. I don't know what happened there, but I couldn't stay to find out.
Story number 6.
When I first moved into my new apartment, I was excited. It was in a great part of town, affordable, and the kind of place I had been dreaming of for months. The building was old but well kept, with a brick exterior and a vintage charm. The landlord, Mrs. Winters, was kind and welcoming. She gave me the keys, showed me around the unit, and assured me that everything was in working order. It was a small one-bedroom apartment on the top floor. The walls were painted a soft beige, the hardwood floors creaked in places, and the view from the large windows overlooked a quiet street with tall trees lining the sidewalk. I felt comfortable there almost immediately, even though I had only been living in the city for a few weeks. Everything was quiet, peaceful, and I had high hopes that this would be a new start. The first few days went by without incident. I unpacked, set up my furniture, and enjoyed the solitude. But then, on the fourth night, things started to feel off. It began with small things I could easily dismiss. The lights in the hallway would flicker, the door to the bathroom would creak open on its own, and once I swore I heard someone whispering, though no one else was around. I chalked it up to the building's age. Maybe the wiring was old, or the wind was causing the door to shift. But there was always a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite shake. That night, I was lying in bed, just drifting off to sleep, when I heard it. A soft thud, like something heavy had dropped in the living room. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The noise was followed by a low creak, as if someone was walking across the floor. I held my breath, straining to hear any further sounds. Nothing came. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a neighbor upstairs moving around. But the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I became. The apartment felt different somehow. It felt colder, and the air seemed thicker, like something was present, even though I was alone. I decided to check it out. I got out of bed and walked cautiously down the hallway, turning on the lights as I went. The living room looked normal. Nothing was out of place. I turned on the lights in the kitchen, checking the counter, the sink, and the floor. Everything was just as it should be. I told myself I was being paranoid, but as I turned to go back to my bedroom, I caught something in the corner of my eye. A shadow. It flickered, moving across the wall, but when I looked directly at it, it was gone. I stood still, heart racing, trying to tell myself it was nothing. The building was old, and shadows were just a natural part of the environment, but the feeling in my chest didn't go away. It felt wrong, like something wasn't right. I returned to my room and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was watching me. I finally managed to fall into a restless sleep, but when I woke up the next morning, I felt more unsettled than ever. I couldn't explain it. It was as though the apartment had changed overnight. The next few days followed a similar pattern. I'd hear strange noises, footsteps that weren't mine, whispering voices when there was no one around, and sometimes the distinct feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it, but each night it became harder and harder to convince myself that nothing was wrong. On the sixth night, I decided to do some research. I Googled the address of the building, trying to find any history about it. That's when I stumbled upon an article. It was old, about 30 years old, and it mentioned a fire that had occurred in the building when it was still a boarding house. The fire had taken the life of a young woman, a tenant who had been staying in one of the rooms on the top floor, the very floor I was living on. The article didn't give many details, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I wondered if it was just a coincidence, but the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the connection between the strange happenings and the history of the building. I decided to call Mrs. Winters to ask her about the fire. When I asked, she paused for a moment before responding. Her voice grew quiet, almost as if she was afraid. "Yes, there was a fire," she said. "It was a tragic event, but that was years ago. The building's been renovated since then. It's safe now, and there's no need to worry about it." But I could hear the hesitation in her voice, and something about her answer didn't sit right with me. I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. That night, I was determined to get some answers. I decided to go into the building's basement and search for any records or clues about the fire. I had a feeling there was more to the story than I had been told. The basement was dimly lit, with boxes stacked high in every corner. I began going through them, looking for anything related to the fire. After about an hour of searching, I found a dusty old ledger wedged between two crates. It was filled with handwritten notes and dates. Flipping through the pages, I came across an entry that caught my eye. October 3rd, 1989, fire broke out in room 412. A young woman, Maria, perished in the flames. She was alone that night. My stomach twisted. Room 412. That was my apartment. I sat there for a long moment, reading and rereading the entry. I couldn't understand it. I had no idea that my apartment had been the scene of such a tragedy. The feeling of being watched, the strange noises, it all started to make sense. Something was still here. Something tied to the past. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, trying to process everything I had learned. The next day, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay there anymore. Not with the constant feeling that I wasn't alone, not with the knowledge of what had happened in that very apartment. As I left the building, I turned for one last glance at the old structure. The windows of the top floor were dark, but in the reflection of the glass, I thought I saw a figure standing by the window. It was a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She stared at me with an expression of sorrow, as though she was trapped in that space, unable to escape. I never returned to the apartment. I moved to a new place shortly after, but even now, when I close my eyes, I sometimes hear the soft whisper of footsteps, and I can't help but wonder if Maria is still waiting, still trapped in the place where she lost her life. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I had always dreamed of living in a shiny, new apartment in the city. After months of saving, I finally found it. A sleek, modern place in a high-rise building that promised comfort and luxury. It was perfect. An open floor plan, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the skyline, and pristine walls painted a soft white. I was ecstatic. The leasing agent was friendly, eager to show me around, and I could tell that she was proud of the building. She explained that the apartment had just been built, and no one had lived there before. She handed me the keys with a smile, mentioning that if I needed anything, I could always call her. I moved in a few days later. As soon as I stepped inside the apartment, a sense of calm washed over me. The air smelled new, like fresh paint and polished wood. The hardwood floors gleamed, and every light fixture seemed to shine brighter than they should. I set up my things, unpacking the few boxes I had, and before long, the apartment began to feel like home. The first few nights were blissful. I settled into a quiet routine, work during the day, quiet evenings at home with books or TV. But then, strange things started to happen. It began subtly. I would hear faint noises at night, creaks in the walls, or the sound of something shifting in the apartment. I chalked it up to the building settling. After all, it was a new construction, and that kind of thing was bound to happen. But as the days went on, the sounds grew more persistent. It was always at night, after I had settled into bed. The first time I heard it clearly, I was lying in bed, just starting to drift off to sleep. A soft tapping noise echoed from the corner of the living room. I froze, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe a branch scraping against the window? I got up to check, but the room was empty, and there was no sound. I felt silly for even getting up. The tapping didn't stop, though. It became a regular occurrence, a rhythmic knocking that sounded like someone was lightly rapping on the walls. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. Sometimes the kitchen, sometimes the hallway, but it was always faint enough to make me question whether I was imagining it. Then came the cold spots. The first one appeared in the bathroom. I had just finished showering and stepped out, only to feel a sudden chill in the air, like someone had opened a window despite the fact that all the windows were tightly shut. The temperature difference was striking. Just a small section of the room, but it felt like icy fingers brushing against my skin. I turned on the heater, but the cold spot remained, as if it were an area of the room that refused to warm up. I told myself I was just getting paranoid. Maybe it was the air conditioning or a draft coming through the walls. But then, things started to happen that I couldn't explain away so easily. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to the apartment to find that the kitchen lights were on. I was sure I had turned them off before leaving, but I dismissed it. Maybe I had forgotten. I turned them off again, then headed to my bedroom to unwind. About an hour later, I walked through the living room and froze. The lights were on again. This time, I was certain that I had not left them on. I walked to the light switch and flicked it off again, my heart beginning to race. When I turned around, the lights flickered briefly and then went out altogether. I stood there, unsure of what to make of it. A technical glitch, I thought. Perhaps the wiring was faulty. That night, I slept fitfully. Around 3 a.m., I was woken by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, light but deliberate, pacing back and forth just outside my bedroom door. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe the building had thin walls and it was someone walking in the hall. But the more I listened, the more certain I became that the footsteps were coming from inside the apartment, not the hallway. I hesitated for a moment before I finally got up. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the city skyline through the windows. I crept down the hallway, but when I reached the living room, everything was as it should be, quiet and still. The apartment was empty. But I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, thick with tension. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows before retreating to my bedroom. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening, but deep down, I knew. This wasn't just a series of coincidences. Someone was in this apartment with me. Over the next week, the occurrences grew more unsettling. I started to notice objects moving. Small things at first. A cup on the counter in the kitchen, a book shifted slightly out of place on the shelf. I thought I might have just been absent-minded, but after a few days, I couldn't deny it anymore. I would leave the room for a few minutes, only to come back and find something had been moved. One morning, I woke up to find a message written on the bathroom mirror. It was faint, as though the words had been smeared with a wet finger. "Get out!" I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of it. It couldn't have been me. I hadn't written anything. Panic started to settle in, but I refused to leave. This was my new home, and I wasn't going to let fear drive me away. But the apartment seemed to have other plans. The worst of it came one night when I returned home after a late shift at work. As I walked through the door, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The apartment was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on you, making your skin crawl. I didn't notice anything out of place immediately, but as I moved further inside, I heard it, the faint sound of a voice. At first, it was just a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was clear that someone was speaking. I froze in the doorway, holding my breath, straining to hear. The voice became louder, and I recognized the language. It was English, but the words were twisted, distorted, almost like a chant. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my phone and dialed the leasing agent. When she answered, I barely let her speak before I demanded answers. "Something's wrong with this apartment," I said, my voice shaking. "I need to know what happened here before I moved in." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, she spoke in a low, measured voice. "There was a death, you know. The last tenants, they didn't leave on their own. The building's history, well, it's not exactly what we advertised." I felt my stomach drop. "What happened to them?" I asked, unable to breathe. She hesitated. They disappeared. No one knows what happened to them. It's as if they just vanished." The voice in the apartment grew louder, and I could barely hear her over the static in my ear. "The apartment was never really meant to be lived in," she said quietly before the line went dead. I hung up the phone, trembling. The whispers were getting closer now, like someone was right behind me. I turned, heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. I ran out of the apartment that night, abandoning all my things. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from within those walls. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I knew deep down that I had experienced something truly unexplainable. The leasing agent tried to contact me several times after that, but I refused to go back. They eventually rented the apartment out again, but I heard rumors that the new tenants didn't stay long either. I never found out what happened to the previous tenants, and I don't think I want to. Some things I believe are better left forgotten. Story the end.
Story number 8.
When I moved into my new apartment, I was ecstatic. It was a spacious, modern unit with high ceilings, big windows, and a clean, fresh atmosphere that made it feel like a fresh start. I had just gotten a new job in the city and was looking forward to living alone for the first time. The apartment complex was new, barely a year old, and the leasing agent was enthusiastic, eager to show me the space. The apartment was on the top floor, which gave me an incredible view of the city skyline. The walls were painted a neutral gray, and the kitchen had all the latest appliances. I had a brand new washer and dryer tucked away in the hallway, and the bathroom sparkled with freshly installed tiles. The whole place seemed perfect. There was no reason to suspect anything was off. The first few nights went smoothly. I unpacked my boxes, set up my furniture, and slowly made the place feel like home. But as I started to settle in, I noticed something strange. Every night, without fail, at exactly 3 a.m., I would wake up. I didn't know why. At first, I assumed it was just my body adjusting to a new living space, maybe due to the excitement of being in a new environment. But it kept happening, every night at the same time. I started to hear things around that time too. Soft scratching noises, almost like someone was dragging their nails lightly across the walls. I thought maybe it was the building settling. After all, it was still relatively new. The noise wasn't constant, just these short, eerie scratches that would come and go. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. But then came the footsteps. One night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone walking in the hallway. The floorboards creaked, and I could hear the soft shuffling of shoes across the hardwood. My heart raced. I thought it was a neighbor, but it didn't make sense. No one ever walked this time of night. Most of the residents in the building had regular 9-to-5 jobs, and I hadn't heard anyone outside my door before. I lay there, holding my breath, hoping the footsteps would stop, but they continued, getting closer. I slowly crept out of bed, trying to be as quiet as possible. I peered out into the hallway. It was empty. The building's dim lights cast long shadows along the hallway, but no one was there. I stood frozen for a few minutes, trying to make sense of it. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just too tired. The next few nights, the footsteps returned. Every time, they seemed closer and closer to my door. I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that someone was walking through my apartment, even though I was alone. The sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate steps, like someone pacing back and forth in the hallway outside. I called the leasing agent and told her about the noises. She seemed a bit too casual about it. "Oh, the building is still settling," she said. "You'll get used to it. New places can be noisy." But something about her tone didn't sit right with me. I had already spoken to a few of my neighbors, and none of them had complained about strange noises. Some mentioned the occasional creak, but nothing like what I was hearing. I had to wonder if there was something more to it. Then came the real shock. One evening, I returned home after work, exhausted from a long day. I had left my apartment for a few hours, and as I stepped through the door, I immediately noticed something was off. The living room lights were on, bright and harsh, shining down on the furniture. I had always turned them off before I left. I stood there for a moment, staring at the lights, wondering if I had left them on by accident. But that wasn't the only thing. There, sitting on the coffee table, was a small object I didn't recognize. It was a keychain, a little trinket shaped like a tiny angel. I had no memory of ever owning such a keychain. I walked over to it, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I had checked the apartment thoroughly before I left, and there was no keychain on the coffee table. I would have remembered it. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to rationalize what had happened. I figured it was possible that I had simply forgotten about it. Maybe I had placed it there earlier in the day and forgotten. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. That night, the footsteps came again. I was in bed trying to sleep when I heard them, slow, measured steps in the hallway. This time they were louder, closer. I lay still, my heart pounding, terrified of what I might find if I got up. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. My entire body was frozen in fear. The silence that followed was deafening. And then, in the quiet, I heard something else, a soft, raspy breathing. It was coming from just outside my door, as though someone were standing there, listening, waiting. I held my breath, my hands gripping the edge of the bed. The breath was steady, almost deliberate, like whoever was outside was trying to remain unnoticed. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door, heart hammering in my chest. I opened it quickly, expecting to find something. But the hallway was empty. It was silent, nothing but the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring down the dark hallway, unsure of what I had just experienced. I shut the door quickly and locked it, trembling from head to toe. The next morning, I took the keychain and tossed it into the trash. I didn't know why I kept it, but something about it unnerved me. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong. I decided to try to move on, to ignore the strange happenings. But it didn't stop. The noises continued, each night growing more intense. The footsteps, the breathing, the lights flickering on their own. I started to feel like I wasn't alone in the apartment anymore, like there was something watching me, following me around. I couldn't escape it. I called the leasing agent again. I told her that something was wrong with the apartment. This time, she hesitated. "Look," she said quietly, "I didn't want to mention this to you, but some people have reported strange things happening in that unit before. It's probably nothing, but I think it's best if you get in touch with someone who can help you." My blood ran cold. What did she mean by that? Strange things. Who else had lived here, and why hadn't she told me? I found out later from a neighbor that the apartment had once been rented by a woman who had disappeared without a trace. She had lived there for only a few months before vanishing. No one knew what had happened to her, but the rumors persisted. Some said she had left in the middle of the night. Others claimed she had been disturbed by the same eerie happenings that I had experienced. I moved out a few weeks later. I couldn't take it anymore. The final straw came when I woke up one morning to find my bed sheets pulled off me in the night, as though someone had yanked them off while I was asleep. I didn't stay to find out what else might happen. When I moved into my new apartment, I thought I had escaped the strange occurrences. But every so often, when the city is quiet and the moon is full, I'll wake up at exactly 3 a.m. and the footsteps start again. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I'd spent months searching for the perfect apartment, and when I found it, I knew it was meant to be. A modern, sleek building with tall windows and polished hardwood floors. The apartment was on the 3rd floor in a quiet neighborhood, and it felt like a fresh start after everything I'd been through. The leasing agent was helpful, giving me the tour and reassuring me that everything in the building was new, built only a couple of years ago. There was nothing to worry about. It was the ideal place. I signed the lease and moved in. The first few days were blissfully normal. I unpacked, set up my furniture, and started to feel at home. I was happy with my decision, excited about this new chapter in my life. But then, after about a week, the unease started to creep in. At first, it was small things, a creak in the floorboards when no one was walking, a light flickering when it wasn't supposed to. At night, I often heard faint noises from the hallway, soft tapping sounds like someone lightly knocking on my door. But when I opened it, no one was ever there. I chalked it up to the building settling. It was new, after all, and I figured these were just growing pains, maybe even some random quirks. But as the days passed, I began to feel an increasing sense of discomfort in the apartment. It was like something wasn't quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a strange weight in the air, a stillness that made me uneasy. The turning point came on a Thursday night. I had just gotten back from work, and the apartment was unusually quiet. I had left the light on in the living room, but when I walked in, I immediately noticed something was different. The light was now off. I thought maybe I had accidentally turned it off when I left, so I flipped the switch back on and sat down on the couch. As I settled in, I noticed a feeling of coldness creeping over me. like a draft had snuck in unnoticed. It wasn't just cold in one spot, but all around the room. I stood up and checked the windows, but they were all closed tightly. I checked the thermostat, and the temperature was normal. Still, the cold persisted. I tried to ignore it, but the longer I sat, the more uncomfortable I became. The feeling of being watched was undeniable. I glanced around the room, but everything looked normal. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking my train of thought. I quickly checked it, grateful for the distraction, but when I looked back at the room, my heart skipped a beat. The chair across the room, the one I'd left facing the wall, was now turned toward me. I froze. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe I had accidentally moved it when I walked past? But no, I was certain I hadn't touched the chair. And I never would have left it facing the wall to begin with. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like jelly, and walked over to the chair. It was empty. Nothing unusual about it, but the fact that it had moved by itself made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That night, I didn't sleep much. The sounds continued, the faint tapping, the creaking in the walls, the occasional whisper I couldn't quite make out. I kept the lights on, all of them, just to feel safe. But even then, the apartment felt empty, hollow. It was as if something was lingering in the corners, waiting. The next few days were more of the same, small, strange occurrences that I couldn't explain. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway at odd hours, like someone was pacing just outside my door. When I checked, no one was there. I started to feel like I was losing my mind, questioning my own senses. Could I have imagined it? Was I just being paranoid? But one evening, things took a darker turn. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening. I turned around, expecting to see my neighbor coming through the door, but there was no one. The door to the hallway was still closed, the sound of the door creaking open still fresh in my mind. I walked to the door and opened it, but the hallway was empty. No one had been there. I shut the door quickly, trying to push the thought out of my head. But then I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. A door opening, followed by the sound of soft footsteps shuffling on the floor. I rushed to the living room, looking around frantically, but everything seemed still. The apartment was eerily silent, except for the soft whispering that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone was dead. It had been fully charged when I set it down earlier. I thought about leaving, but something kept me rooted to the spot. There was an overwhelming sense of dread in the apartment, as though it was pulling me in, trapping me there. That night, the activity in the apartment escalated. I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open, despite the fact that I had closed it before bed. The lights in the hallway were flickering, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just the building's electrical wiring. But then I heard a voice, soft at first, then growing clearer. It was a woman's voice, low and raspy, as though she were speaking right next to me. "Help me." I shot up in bed, my heart racing. The voice sounded so real, so close. But when I looked around the room, I was alone. The whispering had stopped. I was paralyzed with fear, my body stiff with tension. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I felt like I was suffocating. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the leasing agent, desperate for some sort of explanation. When she answered, her voice was calm, almost too calm. "Is something wrong with the apartment?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated. I wasn't going to mention it, but I think you should know that there's a history with that unit. It was rented out to someone before you, a woman. She lived there for about 6 months before disappearing without a trace. No one knows what happened to her. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean, disappeared? Was she murdered? I don't know. Some say she was just gone. Others claim she never left. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry you're experiencing this. I should have told you earlier, but it was complicated. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman who had lived in my apartment was gone, but her presence felt as real as if she were still there. The whispers, the cold spots, the strange noises, it all made sense now. She hadn't left. She was still there, lingering in the walls, trapped in the apartment she had once called home. I left that evening. I packed a few things and made a hasty exit, too terrified to stay another night. The leasing agent offered to help me find another unit, but I refused. I couldn't stay another night in that apartment, not after everything that had happened. I never found out what happened to the woman who lived there before me. Maybe she left. Maybe she disappeared. Maybe she's still there waiting for the next person to come along. All I know is that I'll never go back to that apartment again. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I moved into my new apartment at the end of June, eager for a fresh start. It wasn't far from my office, so the commute would be easy, and the apartment itself was perfect. 2 bedrooms, a balcony with a view of the city, modern fixtures, and a spacious kitchen. The building was only a few years old, and the leasing agent reassured me that it was in great shape, well-maintained, and quiet. It seemed like the ideal place for someone looking for a peaceful environment to call home. The first few weeks went by without incident. I unpacked my things, set up my furniture, and enjoyed the freedom of having a space all to myself. The neighbors were friendly, though I didn't have much interaction with them. It was the kind of building where everyone kept to themselves. At night, the only sound I could hear was the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional car passing by on the street below. But then, around the 3rd week, I started noticing things that were odd. At first, they were small, easy to dismiss as coincidences or the house settling. A light bulb that flickered on and off, a draft that seemed to come from nowhere, the sound of something scratching lightly against the walls. I ignored them, chalking them up to the quirks of a new apartment. However, the noises began to grow more frequent, more intense. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to hear the distinct sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the floor of my living room. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I was sure someone was in the apartment. I held my breath and listened, waiting for the next sound, but there was nothing. The silence was deafening. I got up and checked every room, even the bathroom, but there was no one there. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The next night, I heard the same thing. Footsteps in the living room at 3 a.m. Again, I got up to check, and again, I found nothing. This time, though, something felt different. There was an eerie stillness that hung in the air, as if something was waiting, watching. The 3rd time it happened, I had had enough. I called the leasing office and told them about the noises. The agent on the other end of the line seemed concerned, but ultimately brushed it off. "It's probably just the building settling," she said. I wouldn't worry about it. But I did. I began to wonder if the building had a history, if there was something I didn't know about the apartment. I started asking my neighbors if they'd ever experienced anything strange, but they all seemed unaffected. "Oh, it's just the walls," one of them said, shrugging. "They make noises sometimes. Don't worry about it." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The footsteps continued, always at the same time, every night. But now, there was something else, something more disturbing. One night, I woke up to find the kitchen light on. I had specifically turned it off before going to bed. I went to check, thinking maybe I had forgotten, but when I walked into the kitchen, I saw that the cupboard doors were slightly ajar. I had closed them before bed, and I was sure of it. It felt as if someone had been in there, moving things around. I decided to call the leasing office again. This time, I was more persistent. The agent was less friendly this time, telling me that the building was new and that nothing unusual had been reported. She assured me that I was probably just adjusting to a new living environment. But I knew something was wrong. The noises grew louder, more aggressive. The footsteps started to sound more like running, and sometimes I would hear them in the hallway just outside my door. The whispers began, too. Soft voices, barely audible, but undeniably there. They sounded like they were coming from behind the walls. I would sit up in bed, straining to hear, but whenever I listened closely, the voices would stop. It was as if they knew I was listening. I tried to dismiss it all as stress, as the result of too many late nights at work. But one evening, as I was sitting in the living room watching TV, I heard something that made my blood run cold. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, just a fleeting glimpse, passing by the hallway. I froze, my heart racing, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The shadow was gone, and there was no sound. The next day, I decided to do some research. I looked up the apartment building online, trying to find any information I could. It wasn't long before I found something that sent a chill down my spine. The previous tenant of my apartment, a woman named Emily, had been found dead in the building under mysterious circumstances. According to the local news report, she had lived there for only a few months before her death. The police had never found any evidence of foul play, but her death had been ruled as suspicious. Her family was never contacted, and no one knew where she had gone before her death. The article mentioned that Emily had been a reclusive person, never socializing with the neighbors and always staying to herself. No one had really gotten to know her. The apartment had been empty for several months before I moved in. Suddenly, everything made sense. The whispers, the footsteps, the shadow. It wasn't my imagination. Emily was still there. She hadn't left the apartment. That night, I could no longer ignore the feeling of being watched. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, Emily's face, pale and lifeless, watching me from the darkness. I felt a cold chill settle in the room, and the faint sound of whispering filled my ears. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I packed my things and left the apartment, unable to stay any longer. The leasing agent called me to ask why I was leaving so suddenly, but I didn't answer. I just wanted to be gone. I couldn't stay in a place that felt so haunted, so filled with the presence of someone who was no longer there but somehow still was. I never found out the full truth about Emily or what had happened to her, but I've always wondered if she's still there, in that apartment, waiting for the next person to come along. Story the end.